So I want to continue our series with a movement toward how the pre-ontos represents itself in modern existentialist literature, philosophical literature. I had a great question on another one of these lectures, and I want to walk through essentially a syllabus of activity which I'm using to drill this period of time, again, which I am saying Western existential philosophical literature, from pre-modernity into modernity, and the capstone text, which I have listed here. So I'll actually go ahead and just detail that right now. My ground is Percy Shelley. And the reason why Shelley is the ground for this project is because Shelley is an encapsulation of the term which I have used consistently throughout these lectures and throughout my written works of the past couple of weeks and months, which is the Renaissance mind. So I discussed this in terms of neurosomatic architecture in I believe several written works. I don't think it's been done thoroughly here via lecture. But Shelley, the great unifier, the ontological unifier. So I brought up Shelley in relationship to Da Vinci. There's aspects of Goethe. It is the refusal of disciplinary bounds and the striving, in a modern sense, right, through disciplinary bounds toward disclosure of the ontos, which is a leveraging of the intellectual, spiritual, and existential project towards liberation, which culminates for Shelley in Prometheus Unbound, which I view as an artifact of primary disclosure, structurally, in terms of the primary human condition, which is constraint. It is persistence against constraint, not only in the body, but in the grounds of history and time, and that time itself, both as physically experienced in the body through degradation and entropy, but also time itself as it is experienced neurosomatically through the rise and fall of civilizations, parties, and standing orders, is the primary pursuit of Shelley's Prometheus, to liberate the thermonuclear energy within constraint, space, time, and body. So Shelley is the primary ground here, and then we move from there into Baudelaire. For the purposes of the project, La Fleur du Mal is the primary text. I also have the wreckage, the censored text, as being critically important, because what we're going to discuss here, I'm going to bring this around to Kafka in a moment. We're going to discuss the historical conditions which allow for these works to emerge, because it is a historical phenomenon. After Baudelaire, I have The Underground Man, Dostoevsky, Season in Hell by Rimbaud, Sebastian in Dream by George Trakl, or Georg Trakl. The Metamorphosis by Kafka, 150 Million by Vladimir Mayakovsky, Journey to the End of the Night by Celine, which I would describe as perhaps the foundational text outside of time. I have a significant essay, I believe, about him. I don't think we've done a lecture. So this is a hinged text. It's extremely important, but it's obviously not literary. It's Heidegger's first work on Hölderlin in 1937, the first solo published version of that work. It was published in a journal in 1936 at the end of the year. Nausea by Sartre, The Human Crisis, lecture by Camus, To Be Done with the Judgment of God, Artaud, Waiting for Godot, Samuel Beckett, The Fall, again by Camus, and The Passion of G.H. by Clarice Lispector. So this is the oeuvre that I'm working with, and where I really wanted to go with this is to work specifically with Kafka and a discussion of the emergence of the kind of the gape, or the gates of hell that open in modernity. And those gates of hell are nothing more or less than the resurgence of the pre-modern and even the pre-linguistic ontos. So I've written a text which I think very clearly structurally captures this. I titled it Underneath the Long Street, short story. It's the theme of the descent through modernity, which is the consumption of the standing order. So I want to describe that a little bit, specifically as it relates to Kafka's biography. And so, as we know, Kafka lived his entire life as an insurance salesman, a kind of bureaucratic fate within the infernal machine, which is shared by Pessoa, and T.S. Eliot as well, right, working as a banker. We have in Kafka's life what appears to be a very typical, if not slightly closed, modern life. And this is critical to understanding Kafka. Understood by most to be extremely well-read, fluent in literature, everyone from Gogol to Dostoevsky to Kleist. Kleist, I think, was considered by far to be his favorite. We have a very internal life that is lived by Kafka, even as he functions as a unit of labor in the collapsing world of the Austro-Hungarian empire. And the experience of Kafka is really, for the most part, only externalized in the texts, whether that be the trial or Hunger Artist or Metamorphosis. There's very little record even of texts being published by Kafka in his time. Multiple texts were published by Kurt Wolff, who also published Trackle, in Kafka's lifetime, but they were effectively unknown and unread, including what is considered very clearly to be his masterpiece, The Metamorphosis. And what I want to speak about here is Kafka, not unlike Artaud, was retroactively diagnosed with several different mental illnesses. And what I want to suggest is that psychiatry is inefficient to describe the real phenomenon which is occurring with Kafka, as it is with Trackle, as it is with Artaud. It is often considered to be the primary maybe dialogue that occurs behind the scenes of what Kafka or Trackle or Artaud is saying or doing. And obviously for Artaud it becomes a primary theme in his lived life, the movement in and out of various different sanitariums and electroshock treatment. And what I want to discuss, and I think The Metamorphosis, which is of course his best known work, tells the tale the best, is this resurgence of the pre-modern ontos in the we could just say the sensitive artist or the Renaissance mind, which is again, as I said, a neurosomatic presence of being. And what I'm suggesting here is that this presence of being whether we see it in Kafka or in Artaud or in Mayakovsky, is fundamentally at odds with empire or the standing order, which we see in modernity to have acquired and continue to acquire extreme attributes of unitization of life. That this experience, this lived experience, is itself a highly erotic experience. And what I mean by erotic is eros. And what I mean by eros is presence. Presence of body, presence of mind, presence of being in time. The lived felt sensation, which is detailed exquisitely and consistently and concretely in Kafka's works, as it is with the thunderous poetics of Mayakovsky, which are near perpetual, as it is with Trakhl's kind of exquisitely depicted dream states. A presence of body. And this pairing, which is pointed out by a literary theorist, Gerhard Reich, there's a pairing of Gregor and his sister Greet. One passive, austere person and another active, more libidinal person. And what I want to suggest here at the deepest level is the importance of the transformation or the metamorphosis underwent in the titular story. That, of course, this is a clear analog to Kafka. Gregor is the main character working as a traveling salesman, wakes up one morning to find himself transformed into an insect. And this makes him unable to work. Then he is then isolated from society, and then often both misunderstands the true intentions of others and is misunderstood. So the issue is with Kafka, as with Trakhl or Mayakovsky or Celine, that this form of consciousness in modernity, which is the existential philosophical lineage that I've just described, is too permeating and permeable to be abstracted or assigned to the standing order. It cannot be assimilated into this sort of imperial conquest of nature and the human being and the human body by name and number, whereas much, if not all, of the existing modern world seems to be. And that the sensitivity of this mind or this being, which is itself a wholeness of presence, is not, as it is being depicted through literary fiction or poetry, is not conquerable, precisely because it perceives and is in communion with disclosure. And this state of being in relationship to disclosure is one that we've discussed thoroughly in terms of poetically dwelling. And the appeal to the insect or the bug in Kafka, just as almost absurdly it appears again in the final text that I've discussed in this syllabus, so to speak, with Passion of G.H. Along with Trakhl's dream articulations, or dream environments, dream movements, as well as Mayakovsky's triumphant unification of collective individualism, which itself is a kind of profound form of poetic populism, where he is speaking in, for, and with the body of the 150 million. This state of consciousness is itself a deeply unified intuition, as we experience with Kafka's regular invocation of the animal. A profound form of actually deep humanism, which is itself a human. It is a deeper ontological intuition of the groundswell of life. And this is why in Trackle, I mean, there could have been an incredibly rich work done by Freud or Jung on Trackle. As well as with the works of Mayakovsky and Kafka. The subconscious, or the collective, or the animal, or the bug. And here I could evoke Percy Shelley's Sensitive Plant and his writings on vegetarianism, also of which Kafka was a vegetarian, are intuitions of a deeper humanitarianism. And by this humanitarianism, I don't simply mean human. I mean a force of life or a force of being, which itself is unsegregated to the human condition or the human body. And I've formalized this very clearly in my persistence and constraint operator, which is the operator identity based in thermodynamics, which functions across all scales of being. That which exists is in a state of persistence, in the sense that it has pseudo-closed borders and boundaries, and is as such a technology of persistence against constraint, which is fundamentally an entropic universe. And so this is a question of what is being, and Kafka's metamorphosis or transformation, as is Lispector's metaphysical, mystical experience, crushing the cockroach, as well as with Mayakovsky's continual evocation of a almost seemingly impossible collective body, actually remind me deeply of Vishvarupa in the Bhagavad Gita, when Arjuna interrogates Krishna's true form, and it is revealed to him. This intuitive perception, which I'm saying is integral to this condition of neurosomatic sensitivity, is not in relation to standing orderization, which is a violence of symbolic division. This is why I've discussed the seeming paradox of using language itself as a process of detailing or thinking with languaging to articulate, but it is in the strange paradoxical way the only way to articulate this condition, which is also and often why the Tao refers to it as the ineffable. The Tao Te Ching being perhaps one of the primary world historical texts of this phenomenon. That to understand, as Kafka does, the consequences of this pre-ontological intuition in modernity, which is precisely why we get the strange hue and the aesthetic power of his works, as we do with Trackle or we do with Mayakovsky, is it is a condition which is irreconcilable to the birth of global modernity, which is again the birth of the symbolic order as standing order. That world itself is being rapidly inscribed and transcribed via information technology and industrial technology, which itself is emerging from science. A name and a number, a unit, and a definition, which, as I've said, culminates in the discharging of the atom bomb. And this itself, to the sensitive, which Kafka here is distinguished from the passionate ontological pursuit of Shelley or Da Vinci, just because it is a pursuit for Kafka which is not nearly so unified, although Kafka is extremely well-read philosophically and literarily. That this condition of sight or of seeing, which I'm describing not as a learned state, but rather as a lived state, a somatic state. You could say a nervous condition, as in a neurological condition. This is the temptation, historically, that we witness to psychiatrize the Mayakovsky or Kafka or Trakl. Perhaps harder to do so with Dostoevsky or Beckett due to the sheer kind of historical magnitude of the intellectual body that, looking back posthumously, that someone like Dostoevsky inhabits. Kafka himself appears more reticent, reluctant, passive, and private, which of course opens up the door to a psychiatrization of his state of being. What I want to suggest here is the struggle to human eyes, consciousness itself, in the Metamorphosis, and the function of the vermin, or the cockroach, or however the translation you seek to translate this figure, this insect. In the original German, it's monstrous vermin. It's often depicted as a cockroach, and I think cockroach is an important way of deepening the metaphysical and ontological implications of the story. That for Kafka, consciousness itself is a deep time construct. It is an ontologically unbroken stream of energy and time, which is deeply Platonic in the sense of time as a moving river of eternity. The image of the moving river of eternity. That Kafka's, and I'm going to describe it as an intuition because it's never formalized philosophically, but it's present throughout his works, is that this state of consciousness, as inhabited by Joseph K. or in the trial or Gregor Samsa, is the operative consciousness of Kafka himself, attempting to function within the seeming bureaucratic normalcy of collapsing empire, which is the standing order, symbolic order of appropriated everyday life in human existence. And my graduate school work, my thesis on Mayakovsky, centered around the way that Mayakovsky formalized, because Mayakovsky did formalize this concept. It was the concept of byt, or the everyday. That Mayakovsky's chief rebellion, deeply in union with Shelley, was against the everyday, which was the condition of this constrained, quiet submission or repression of the ontological and existential condition of being human into the fabric of the cultural or civilizational everyday, which is the typical movements, which for Kafka are both bureaucratic and let's say rote, culturally trained, or somatically and neurologically ingrained, as in the regular pathways which are taken in life. And this is Kafka's tension and contradiction at the heart of many, if not all, of his works, is that within Kafka is obviously an individual of great magnitude, but this individual of great magnitude is let's say, either working as a traveling salesman or working as an insurance salesman. You can see here what in the plot of Metamorphosis, Samsa sees his employer as a despot and would quickly quit his job if he were not his family's sole breadwinner and working off his bankrupt father's debts. So you can see with Kafka, and Arendt gestures to this with, I think it's Between Past and Future, a parable of Kafka's being pulled between everything, the past, which is to say the history which births him, and the future of the possible world in which could be. And this so much I see of Kafka's spirit is this being trapped within history, and that which produces the existential nausea, which I would say 2 decades later is formalized quite clearly by Sartre as the definitional condition of modernity, which is a profound nausea, which Camus also calls the absurd. And what's interesting with Camus is that Camus' absurdity, which he says is existential condition, I would say is actually a condition of time. It's a condition of history. It's a condition of the time in which Camus is speaking, which is the 1950s. That life itself has become so absurd and so symbolically bankrupt, and that the everyday has become so rote, so unitized, so monetized, commercially controlled, advertised, and under the banner of global modernity, stricken as a standing order from the possibility of this deeper somatic relationship, which is rare to, as we discussed, the poets or the mystics or the shaman. That these constraints, as in the closure of history, has become so immense that the horrified cockroach or insect of Gregor Samsa, which we later see in a different dialectical relationship in The Passion of G.H., in the crushing of the cockroach, which leads to this gateway or this opening of this experience of the substrate of consciousness, which Trakel also digs into. This is great theme of Carl Jung as Germany descends into fascism with Nazi Germany. Kafka himself being a strident, opposing figure to this process. That we see these descents, right, into, as Jung would call, the collective unconscious, and this ground, which I think is deeply correctly articulated and intuited in the Metamorphosis as it is in the Passion of G.H., is this supersomatic union of the cockroach and the human being, which is far beneath the standing order of human beings, which is the imposition of a symbolic order which dictates the life of the everyday, which is the butcher shop or the banker, the accountant, and this functional infrastructure and language of the everyday is, as Shelley articulates in Prometheus Unbound, a deep binding, a historical binding of, you could call it the passion, or the libido, or the eros, or the, I would call it the thermodynamic and thermonuclear potentialities of being human. The possibilities within the informational technological vessel of the human being and the human body to be explored in a lifetime, which is to say the entropic period of pseudo-closed boundary of the human vessel in relationship to the entropic universe, which is movement towards dispersion, dissipation. So this itself, the everyday as Mayakovsky describes it, or Biet, is considered to be the prison against which Mayakovsky is sort of wailing or confronting. And Mayakovsky's poems, in their vigor, which I would also describe this as a libidinous figure, I would say. The passion and the courage at which Mayakovsky hurls himself at the process of thinking through languaging is a profound example of what we see in Kafka, perhaps more passively entrapped within the historical current of what both of these writers and thinkers are doing in their time, which is to say, understanding how the standing order is in relationship to ontological disclosure. And ontological disclosure in history, again, being very different than the ancient Greek ensoulment, in which the human being and the human body exist within nature, as in the Greek poets, as a sort of idyllic or even pastoral thread. And in modernity, as we reach the turn of the 20th century going forward, this experience is a horror or a terror of being pulled between two great forces, which is the deep ontological current of the cosmos, which connects man and the cockroach and the plant via this thermonuclear transformation, which forms neurological sentience in the human being. And again, we've gone over this with the genome. And this second current, this dialectical motion, which is continuing to narrow, which is the standing orderization of nature and man, which is industrial technological modernity, which closes its grips through world wars and the compression of space and time into supply and distribution channels of information and energy into a system. And I've described this since I was very young as a Molochian system, or a system of feeding the human being and nature into the fire, which is called perhaps progress or nation, or whatever title you wish to give to it. And this itself being the second rock upon which Prometheus is chained. It's not only the rock of the physical body, which is the persistence through constraint, which grants the possibility of sight, the possibility of being in time, which is the possibility of disclosure. But it is also the historical, political, and economic standing orderization of being in time and being itself into commodity, into unit, and into name. And this again is the primary difficulty of Kafka, which he is describing through the bureaucracy of the trial, or the transformation of the metamorphosis. That Kafka has a profound intuitive rebellion in his very being, which is not so much a rebellion as it is a forced confrontation with the poet of the ontos in unfolding industrial technological modernity. This is a lived, felt condition, which is not, as we understand very clearly in Kafka, this is not a ideological stance. This is a way of being in time, a way of being in consciousness or awareness. It is a presencing position in relation to being. Through Kafka, we understand through the parable or the metaphor, which is itself, you could say, existential literary fiction, of the contradiction and the contraction, the difficulty and the mutilation of this experience in modernity. So modernity itself is producing this category of existential literature. It emerges from the historical moment of being in time, as it is the poet who was once formerly the medicine or the shaman is now the clerk or the insurance salesman, trapped within the bureaucratic machine of the standing order, and is now detailing this grotesque abstraction, this symbolization into name and number and currency of the experience in which ancestrally maybe the Greek poet would describe a bliss of ontological union with being through the experience of nature. And that this is what's so critical about the historical development of the standing order as an industrial technological modernity, that nature as the communal ensouled experience of being in a profoundly atechnological society or detechnologized society. It it can't be de-technologized because there was no technology to strip, but rather a society which has not yet leveraged or is not leveraging the full extent of the fossil fuel energy, the oil and electricity to power the modern world, is not having the experience of this protracted symbolic chain of alienation, which becomes modernity, which is the institution of the factory upon the ground of the, you could say, the waterfall, or the raising of the mountain for fossil fuels or precious metals or materials. This harvesting of nature itself is the condition in which the stage is being set for, you'd say, Kafka or Trackle. And this appears deeply in Trackle, as it does with Celine, in the industrial process of modern war, in which there is this terrified recoiling from this bureaucratic machine of the prosthetic leg and the machine gun and mustard gas, which is a weaponization of nature. Again, weaponization and standing orderization are the same, because it is the turning of nature into a unit of energetic currency, which is then being consumed or discharged. And this is in deep relation to science. And we see this in Blake's skepticism, just as we see it in Shelley's intuition of the rise and fall of civilizations in Hellas. So what's fascinating is we could look at the poem Mont Blanc with Shelley, and we could see the difference in perception, because Shelley gives us the poem and we're able to look back and reflect upon the poem, whereas, for instance, maybe the modern concept or modern use of fracking, which itself is entirely it's a modern word because it's a modern process. It's coming out of standing orderization through the technological implement of nature as an abstraction and extraction. That Shelley's view of Mont Blanc is itself the key to this deeper ontological formulation of consciousness, wherein he describes how is it possible to perceive the mountain and what is my relationship to the mountain, even as the mountain is a constraint formation, or a configurational constraint formation, and Shelley is a regulational neurological being, experiencing time and entropy, as in the universe, in a very different way. But he is in communion with this force of being, just as Kafka is with the cockroach, or GH is with the cockroach. This is a way of being and a site which itself was formerly, as we discussed, the historical foundation, as in the ontological register of civilizations and cultures, which Shelley articulates as the poets being the unacknowledged legislators of history and civilization. But the poet is no longer the unacknowledged legislator. The poet is the subversive, censored worker or laborer in the bureaucratic machine, raising this profound contradictory statement, which is in itself, at the deepest level, an argument for the return to the ontos in the midst of this madness, this chaos and madness of modernity, which the poet sees clearly as absurd, useless, meaningless, and away from any sort of existential concern of being human, into a total weaponization of being human into an energetic unit, which is then being fought over and controlled. This is everything from relationship to the mountain, to the cockroach, to oil, etc. Standing orderization of nature. And Kafka's concerns therein, as in his concerns with relationship, his concerns with self, all of which are described historically as neurotic and even perhaps mentally ill conditions, schizoid, etc., these isolated protagonists facing bizarre and surreal predicaments and incomprehensible socio-bureaucratic powers. This is where Kafka, with even a cursory reading of Marx or a cursory reading of Marcuse or a cursory reading of thermodynamics, or a cursory reading of Freud's Civilization and Discontents, produces for us a quite clear understanding with Camus or with Ernest Becker that Kafka is in relationship to the absurdity not only of the patriarchal condition of the overbearing father of Hermann, which is his childhood and his relationship to his family, but itself the relationship to the crumbling Austro-Hungarian Empire and the change which is occurring in the early 1900s, which is a total system failure of human possibility in relation to being, which is being replaced by standing orderization of relationship, sexuality, physicality, every aspect of eros in chains, which later is formalized quite well by Marcuse. And this is sort of pre-formalized by Freud in Civilization and Discontents, and this thread which runs through the Frankfurt School is a thread which is articulating formally, and we discussed this in terms of the relationship and movement between the Weimar Republic and the question asked by Heidegger 20 years later. And this is also clear in the union of philosophical existential literature and formalization of philosophical theory or metaphysical statement in Sartre and Camus in the 1950s, is that this experience is being underwent first by the sensitive poetic, and it is being articulated via metaphor and the language of literary metaphor. As in Trackle, I think Trackle is the best example for this, because Trackle is depicting the environment of the death of the ontos, the fading of the light, so to speak, in this corrupt death tunnel, which is the industrial war and industrial revolution of modernity into total standing orderization, via the capture of the energetic unit, which is a deep and total colonization of life and nature. That this experience consumes Kafka and consumes the concerns of his protagonists and characters. That what Kafka experiences himself is the standing order of patriarchy, empire, and industrial technological civilization as it is coalescing in a world historical sense. And this experience is bound up within the process. There is no metaphysical or meta-architectural vantage. And I suggest that this is a combination of Kafka's specific character of being towards literature in particular, as opposed to a unification of that process as we see with Shelley, perhaps more in the Renaissance mind sense. But as well as due to the being in time which Kafka is inhabiting, and the birth of psychoanalysis, just during and slightly after Kafka's time with Freud, is a revolution which is attempting to, first with dreams, articulate this substratum, this architectural substratum of the total unity of being and consciousness through this thermodynamic thread of evolution and the primary informational technology of the genome as it is in relation to the formation and reiteration of the nervous system, which then allows for the possibility of disclosure through enhanced sensitivity of presence and articulation of presence in the nervous system itself, including, of course, the revolutions of the brain. So having Darwin and Boltzmann and Maxwell between Shelley and Baudelaire and Dostoevsky is a fitting historical movement. So, an entry from Kafka's diary, which perhaps will help. Enclosed in my own four walls, I found myself as an immigrant imprisoned in a foreign country. I saw my family as strange aliens whose foreign customs, rights, and very language defied comprehension. Though I did not want it, they forced me to participate in their bizarre rituals. I could not resist. So, this is a almost inversion of the ancestral form of initiation, as would be found in the Eleusinian Greek, or the dead aspect of the Egyptian, that the initiation of modernity is into the absurd totalitarian standing orderization of nature, and that the sensitive poet, or the neurosensitive or neurosomatic sensitivity of the artist, which I've formalized again architecturally in the Renaissance mind as a culmination of that pursuit, is in relationship to dwelling in being. Although he worked in insurance. With Kafka, law has no meaning outside its fact of being a pure force of domination and determination. And that what Kafka is seeking to do in his unification with the human and the animal and the insect is reunify this deeper ground at the most basic, intuitive, and fundamental level of Kafka's human experience, which resists and is in resistance to standing orderization. This hidden bureaucratic or legal or political entity which controls the lives of people who become victims of these systems beyond their control. This is deeply tied to a bureaucratic or totalitarian state, which of course becomes the primary preoccupation and is the primary preoccupation of the through line of early modern Russian literature. That this bureaucratization of world is deeply tied to standing orderization of world, which is the paperwork which releases or expounds or distributes energetic units throughout various different time and space-bound dimensions. This is the political control known as the state or the empire or the corporation, etc. And to stand outside of this, even as he is within it, Kafka's alienation from bureaucracy as this seemingly inescapable system, which is itself a symbolic order, is perhaps the most concrete and clear and existentially literate articulation of the same concepts that Marx is expounding upon in his works on machine culture and machine consciousness, and the warning sign of the expounding of capital, which is nothing more than the standing orderization of the ontological relationship to being, which is in the human, natural, and organic, and common to the cockroach, the plant, and the star, or the cell, as in Shelley's story, The Sensitive Plant. And this realm or mode of perception, you see as Kafka before World War I attends Klub Mladic, Czech anarchist, anti-militarist, and anti-clerical organization. That what we have to understand here is that Kafka's political beliefs are an attempt to state what Kafka understands in relationship to alienation and the symbolic order and standing orderization as it is most clearly articulated in Metamorphosis. That what is first and primary to Kafka's political act or political movement is the ontological intuition or the depth of his relationship to being, which is dwelling poetically, and the absurdity of his condition being trapped within as working in insurance in this sort of common, basic modern life, which is rapidly accelerating. As a profound kind of pre-ontological, zoomorphic, pre-animistic, primordial condition of being, which is cosmological, which Kafka perceives and perennially articulates in his work. And of course, this is bound up in multiple different, in terms of his relationship to Jewishness, his relationship to Prague, his relationship to Eastern Europe. There's these different layers and narrative, ideological, and identity-based threads, which of course, in a historical sense and a lived sense, are essential to Kafka's experience. But at this deeper, more foundational level, Kafka's lived and living consciousness are at and in this ontological ground. And we can see here in this diary entry, the tremendous world I have inside my head, but how to free myself and free it without being torn to pieces. 1,000 times rather be torn to pieces than to retain it in me or bury it. That's why I'm here. That's why I'm here. It's quite clear to me. This statement cannot be removed from the historical condition which Kafka is inhabiting. My job is unbearable to me because it conflicts with my only desire, my only calling, which is literature. I am nothing but literature and can and want to be nothing else. A marriage could not change me, just as my job cannot change me. So this again, right, is the strength of Kafka's character and understanding of his own position in relationship to being, which is fundamentally a poetic position, which is dwelling poetically. And this is foundational to his perception, his aperture, which again I'm suggesting is neurosomatic. And Kafka's experience therein, this sense of profound boundedness, which again I'm connecting directly to Shelley here, is the fear of being torn to pieces, or the anguish of the contradiction of modernity, which has clasped its claws about him, is that the conditions of living have become so unitized, right? This compression of culture and civilization into increasing commoditization of information and energy, which is name and number. Kafka is living within this machine, and yet is called to the primary calling, which is the calling of all beings of disclosure, which is to say the poet, the mystic, or the shaman, what will you, to articulate for the community, again in the traditional shamanic or medicine position, the depth of the ontological relation, which is itself the foundation of all possibility of being, and all possibility of meaningful relationship to being and existence itself. That this articulation normally founds civilizations and cultures, but instead it has been buried in an insurance office. And Kafka's struggle, which is seen throughout his life, whether it's political, existential, individual, economic, social, relational, is to emerge into this foundational position, which is itself a position known throughout the entirety of human history, and is abolished in modernity, as we discussed, as modernity itself is a descent into total disclosure of being in each neurosomatic body through what is to say a total closure of the possibilities of existence in nature, which force being in and upon itself in a Jobian position. And so what we have with Kafka, the birth of existential philosophical literature, is itself only a condition of modernity, and is only possible in modernity, and is the reason why we don't have it anywhere else. that it is born specifically in Europe is to say that Europe itself is the breaking point of this pre-ontological ground, as opposed to the Americas, which is to say a profound colonial violence in which there is a assumption of tradition atop the grave of the native paradigm. That Europe itself has a memory, as we understand, and this is why Germany is again the focus. That Europe itself has a memory, and it's hard in my mind to separate Germany from Prague or from Russia, because the modern phenomenon, or France for that matter, because the modern phenomenon that overtakes Germany as the primary industrial movement of modernity, which has to do deeply with the standing orderization of the symbolic order of Western civilizational history, which we've detailed philosophically in the relationship between Plato and Heraclitus, that this occurs in Europe. This occurs in and as Western civilization and spreads as a global phenomenon, as in global modernity, which is the standing orderization of the world into economic units, both of the human being and nature. And this is not ideological, it's primary and first to ideology, which again is why Kafka struggles to articulate, whether that's through political affiliation or in metaphor through his work, what is occurring. Because this process is global, and it is not ideological, it's not nation-state based, it's not even based in a hermetic constitution of a communal life which is being broken open. That the death of Nietzsche's pre-modern Germany is the death of Europe. It is the death of the world. It is the death of a paradigm. It is the death of the pre-modern ontological relationship to being. And this paradigm shift, as I've described, is thermodynamic. It is literally a phase change in the existential relationship to energy, primarily via fossil fuels and electricity, and the technological potentialities which emerge from them, such as the airplane or the atom bomb. Again, right, with nuclear energy as we move forward into the 20th century, that these potentials of harnessing energy, which are founded in the scientific method of the West, which is an inquisition into the particular relationship of being, down to the atom, splitting the atom, fusion and fission, as in Fermi, the Chicago pile, that this relationship is the standing orderization of the symbolic order which the West makes possible, and that this actually becomes the power phenomenon of the world throughout the 20th century, World War I into World War II, into the digital age. Because this is the creation of power which did not formerly exist thermodynamically, thermonuclearly. It is the harnessing of latent powers, which then the battle and the struggle for the ownership of these powers, to discharge these powers, and thus to possess natural power, is the bureaucratic paradigm which Kafka labors in and under, as a clerk, as an insurance salesman. So this is a cloak, much as Mephistopheles envelops the Faustian town, a cloak that envelops Kafka's time, his time and his place. And it is a cloak that consumes Kafka, just as it consumes Trackle. Just as it consumes Mayakovsky. And this cloak at the deepest level is not political, it's not ideological, it's not social, it's not cultural, it's not even civilizational, it's thermodynamic. It is the creation and harnessing of latent natural powers. And in the harnessing, again, the critical aspect of the Western symbolic order is crucial, because it is the standardization of difference of being. And this is harvested and harnessed primarily in Nazi Germany in the relationship of German nationalism to Jewishness or the political other of the world. And we have to understand why this relationship of difference, as in the standardization of the symbolic order, is a unitization of self. It is a boundary of self, whether that's a national or a subjective or an existential boundary, which is broken open by the pre-ontological intuition of Kafka and the Spectre and Trekkel. Because this is a descent into the historical cosmological body of consciousness itself, as in a formation and formulation of being in time, bound both by thermonuclear energy and the transformation of the genome as an iterative process of the development of the nervous system and the mind, which is the brain. And this descent is embodied and inhabited by the poet or the mystic or the medicine. And in modernity, the poet, the mystic, and the medicine is no longer the call sign of the republic or the culture or the tribe, but rather is the censored figure in the face of and in the midst of this phase change of energetic transformation in which national, empirical, political powers are at war for the control over the nuclear weapon or oil, what have you. That no longer are the poets the unacknowledged legislators of civilization, but the poets themselves are the criminals. They are to be feared because their pre-ontological intuition and the articulation, which was formerly the foundation of myth and culture in world history, is now the hateful revelation which spoils the dream of capital, possession, profit, standing order. And this is why Kafka, even in his brief publishing career, was censored, and was censored again in the rise of Nazi Germany. Both having to do with his supposed Jewishness, but also having deeply to do with this delinquent, or the condition of, so to say, delinquent art in Nazi Germany, which was also common to, as we discussed, Gross, Beckmann, and Dies. Because what this is not rather that the art itself is delinquent, but it is revealing the delinquency and the corruption of the standing order, which is bureaucracy, nation, empire of modernity. And it is a calling via proximity to dwelling poetically, whether that's Kafka or Trekkel or Dies, back to relationship to being, which is beneath and beyond man, into nature. This calling, which is quite simply not only humanity, but it is meaningful relationship to being itself, which has nothing to do with being human. Although the configuration of being human makes this possibility available in high resolution, which again is the Renaissance mind, or the neurosomatically sensitive poet. And that without this meaningful relationship to being, totalitarianism is natural. Because if being is just a standing order and it is just a unit, of course it can be distributed, articulated, and at war over as such. Because there is no meaningful life. It's just simply energetic units of measure, which is actually a deeply scientificization of life. It is that life now has a codified name and a clear way to measure its number or its unit. Whether that be money or gallon or barrel, whether that name be some proliferation of Latin or Latinate words to refer to a certain specific type of plant or genealogy. And this is deeply related to the work I've done in the commodification of women, the female body, as foundation of capital. And that the ownership of the body which produces the patrilineal heritage is itself the possibility of inheritance. That through time, ownership can be identified and transferred, as in, so to speak, legacy. And I've discussed this in relationship to genius and made the clear argument that the only inheritance is world historical genius, which allows human being to come in relationship to being itself through articulation, through languaging, through poetic dwelling. And that this inheritance is only universal, it is only global in a grand historical sense. That all other inheritance is trivial and naive in the face of time. So, this is what we got here. I appreciate your time, and I hope you enjoyed.